Hello everybody, my name is Jason Zaballo. I blog under the name The Masked Thomist, and this is episode 1 of the Masked Thomist podcast. So, as I said, I blog under the name of The Masked Thomist, and every now and then I will get asked the question, so what is a Thomist? Simple question. A Thomist is a follower, either philosophically or theologically, of the thinking of the great Saint Thomas Aquinas, the common doctor of the Catholic Church. Simple answer, but raises the question, so who was St. Thomas Aquinas and why is he so important? St. Thomas was born in 1225 in the district of Aquino in northern Italy. His family were minor Italian nobility, and the area from which he was born, Aquino, is where we get the surname Aquinas from. He was sent as a young child to be educated by local Benedictine monks, and as a young child he greatly impressed his teachers by his piety, his devotion to prayer, by his intelligence, and also his great passion to combine the two. So he wanted to use his intelligence to better understand God and better understand how we could know him in order to love him better. His parents had actually hoped that he would join the Benedictine order, become a monk, and possibly become an abbot. However, he made the decision as a young man to instead join the Dominican order. Now, to put that in a bit of context, by the time St. Thomas was born, what we would today call the contemplative monastic orders, such as the Benedictines and the Cistercians, had been in existence for a long time. They were orders where essentially you joined a monastery, and normally, under normal circumstances, you would stay in that monastery until you died. However, in roughly a generation or a generation and a half before St. Thomas's birth, a new form of religious life had been pioneered by St. Dominic and St. Francis. St. Dominic, of course, pioneered the Order of Preachers, also known as the Dominicans. St. Francis pioneered the Order of Friars Minor, or the Order of Lesser Brothers, commonly known today as the Franciscans. And both of these differed from the traditional contemplative orders in that their membership was active. You wouldn't just join a particular monastery and stay there your whole life. You joined the order and then you could be sent all about the country, or indeed all about the world, depending upon where the order felt your talents were needed. And frequently you wouldn't just stay in the houses of your order. You'd go from city to city, from town to town, preaching the gospel or doing whatever missionary activity the order deemed necessary. And whilst you were on the road, you'd generally not take any money with you, you'd sleep wherever you could, you'd beg for your food. And so whilst the more established monastic orders like the Benedictines were seen as respectable, these new orders were seen as somewhat controversial, and certainly for well-to-do people like St. Thomas's family, they weren't so respectable. And the family reacted rather badly to young Thomas's wish to join the Dominican order. His two older brothers kidnapped him, dragged him to the family castle, imprisoned him in his room, and the family basically told him, you can be a secular noble, we'll be happy, you can be a Benedictine, we'll be happy, but you can't be a Dominican, that would disgrace the family. And St. Thomas was quite clear that no, this is what I'm being called to. There was one incident during his captivity where, if the stories are to be believed, his family actually introduced a prostitute into his bedroom in the hope that she would be able to dissuade him from clinging to his ideas of the chastity, which was an obviously essential part of religious life. St. Thomas took a brand from the fire, chased her out of his room, and was then visited by two angels who wrapped a cord around his waist as a symbol of this great victory that he'd won and of the promise that he would remain chaste throughout his life. Eventually, after roughly 12 months of imprisonment, through intervention of no less a person than the Pope, St. Thomas was able to be released to join the Dominican order and to begin his studies for the priesthood. Now, this was an incredibly interesting and important time from the point of view of the great ongoing dialogue which happens between faith and reason, or between theology and philosophy. The reason for this is that the writings of the great Greek philosopher Aristotle had, generally speaking, at the beginning of the Middle Ages, as a result of the activity of various barbarians, been lost to the Christian West. In the 13th century, as a result of the intercourse that was happening between Christian and Islamic society, as a result in part of the Crusades, those writings of Aristotle began to be reintroduced to the West. And so there was a big question of, how do we understand these great philosophical works, and how do they integrate with our faith understanding of the world? So St. Thomas was studying for the priesthood at a time when this was a big question. And he had the good fortune of studying under St. Albert the Great, or Albertus Magnus, who had, in a sense, was one of the figures who had begun this great study and integration of Aristotle. Now, when St. Thomas began his studies for the priesthood, there was a bit of a misunderstanding because of his incredible humility. He didn't want to show off how smart he was, and as a result of that, his fellow students and even some of his teachers thought he was incredibly dumb. There's a famous story of a group of Dominican students, studying in their monastery one day, and as an aside, it's important to note that the Dominican motto is Veritas, which means truth. And one of the students looked out the window and then turned to Thomas and said, "Hey, brother Thomas, there's a pig flying past the window. Look, there's this flying pig. It's got wings." St. Thomas hurried over to the window to see this flying pig, whereupon his brothers fell about laughing, and it was like, "Oh, Thomas, could you really be so stupid as to actually think there was a flying pig out there?" And St. Thomas turned to them and said, "Well, I knew it was unlikely, but I thought it was better to assume that a pig would fly than that a Dominican would lie." And needless to say, his brothers all felt rather properly put in their place and a bit embarrassed after that. But eventually, St. Thomas's great intelligence was discovered, and the aforementioned Albertus Magnus declared, "We have called Brother Thomas the dumb ox, but I promise you there will come a day when the whole world will listen to the bellowing of his doctrine." So St. Thomas was ordained to the priesthood. He became a professor of philosophy at the University of Paris and became one of the best-known philosophers and theologians that the world has ever seen. His importance lies in part, as I said, he was a crucial figure in integrating the Aristotelian thought, which was coming back into Western Europe, into Christian philosophy and theology. And as St. John Paul II says, he is therefore one of the great crucial figures in the ongoing dialogue between faith and reason, and in the question of how faith can be reconciled with reason and how we can understand our faith in a well-reasoned way. Now, obviously, there have been a great number of brilliant philosophers and theologians throughout the Church's history, and there are a great number of thinkers and saints that are worthy of study. It's important to understand, however, that St. Thomas plays a very special place in this history. John the 22nd, the Pope who canonized St. Thomas, declared, quote, "St. Thomas has illuminated the Church more than all the other doctors have combined." Pope St. Pius V, another Dominican, who conferred upon St. Thomas the title of Doctor of the Church, declared him the most brilliant light of the Church and a most certain rule of Christian doctrine. Pope Leo XIII, in his famous encyclical Patre Aeternus, proclaimed St. Thomas to be the common doctor of the whole Church and insisted that it was important for St. Thomas's philosophy and theology to form the basis of the training of priests. Now, it's important to understand what these popes are and aren't saying. They're not saying that St. Thomas was infallible. He wasn't. Popes are infallible. General councils of bishops are infallible. individual theologians are not infallible, even if the individual theologian in question is named Thomas Aquinas. Also, the Church has never said you have to be a Thomist. In fact, as St. John Paul II was quite clear to point out, the Church has never said you have to follow this or that school of philosophy, because that would interfere with the properly autonomous role of reason and philosophy. What the Church has said, however, is that St. Thomas's philosophy provides a steady and reliable starting point for any form of Christian formation or for basic Christian doctrine. So if you're a Catholic who is interested in getting a more philosophically and theologically grounded statement of the faith, I think it's fair to say that the Church says you don't need to become a Thomist. I'd love it if you did. I think more Thomists would make the world a better place. But the Church doesn't say you have to be one. But I think it is fair to say that the Church recommends making a study of St. Thomas your starting point. Now, having said that, I should say a little bit about the 5 Ways, or the Quinque Via, which is the series of 5 proofs for the existence of God which St. Thomas puts forward. St. Thomas puts these 5 proofs forward fairly early on in his great masterwork. His great masterwork is called the Summa Theologica, which is essentially a textbook for men studying theology with a view towards being ordained priests. And it's important to understand that before one started studying theology, one would do a number of years' study of philosophy. So the book is intended for people who've already got a significant grounding in philosophy. And these 5 proofs for the existence of God, I firmly believe that that all 5 of them are solid and valid proofs of God's existence. But they're not intended to be read by people who are coming to the issue or to the discussion with no prior grounding or formation. The idea is that they are summaries of longer, more detailed arguments that the student would already have been expected to have read earlier in their studies and formation. And this is important because you will occasionally find people who are critiquing St. Thomas reading these 5 proofs out of context, as if you could just read them and get the bulk of his argument just from that. Actually, you can't. You really need a bit more formation and grounding in what St. Thomas thinks and what he's arguing. Also, for example, Richard Dawkins in The God Delusion makes this big thing of, well, even if we accept that St. Thomas proves that there has to be an unmoved mover or an uncaused cause, he doesn't give us any reason to think that cause has to have an intelligence, or that cause has to be a person in any sense that we'd accept, or that there has to be only one of them. Well, actually, St. Thomas does give reasons for all of that. He doesn't give them within the passage that is generally thought of as the 5 Ways. But as I said, that's the problem, is that you're reading out of context. You're reading by itself a passage that is supposed to be read in the context of a larger work. So certainly for any Catholic who wants to understand the rational grounds for believing in God and wants to show that God's existence can be demonstrated without reference to faith or the Bible or divine revelation, St. Thomas's 5 proofs are a great way to do that. But I think it's a big mistake to simply read the 5 proofs as they exist within the Quinque Via and think, that that's enough. So why is St. Thomas important? Well, he's important, as I said. He is a huge figure within the history of the relationship between faith and reason. He's important because his teaching in philosophy and theology has been called by the Church a sure foundation, a great light to the Church. He is also important, though, because of his personality. I've touched a bit on his incredible humility. He was also a man brimming over with charity. There are a great many, accounts of people who knew him talking about how much every person who met him, from the most brilliant to the most politically powerful, to the humblest peasant who met him, who felt themselves to be deeply loved by him, and felt that Thomas always cared about each and every individual as a person. He's also important, and this may sound paradoxical, because whilst he was a great philosopher and theologian, he always understood that these things were not the be-all and end-all. There is, I think, for those Christians who get deeply into philosophy, theology, apologetics, to treat these things as if they were an end in themselves. St. Thomas always understood they were not an end in themselves, they were a means to the greater end of understanding God better, so that in the ultimate end, by understanding God better, we could love God better. And there's a very important, interesting thing that about a year before St. Thomas died, he stopped all his writings. And the reason he gave was that he had had a great vision of God, and that he said, I cannot write anymore because everything I have written seems so much straw next to what has been revealed to me. So he always had his philosophy and theology within the proper perspective. And one final point that I think is relevant to our modern day, St. Thomas is important because he entered into dialogue not just with pagan thinkers like Aristotle, but with the great Jewish philosopher Moses Maimonides, and perhaps most importantly of all, with a number of significant Islamic thinkers. Particularly, there was an Islamic thinker by the name of Ibn Rushd, or generally known in the West by his Latin name Averroes. And St. Thomas always refers to Averroes as the commentator, which may sound like a slightly weird name to call someone, but in those days an absolutely central part of philosophy was writing commentaries on the works of others. So you had a great book by Plato or Aristotle, and then some more contemporary figure would come along and write a commentary on it. And in a context where practically everyone is writing commentaries, St. Thomas thought Ibn Rushd or Averroes' commentaries were so important that he gave him the nickname the Commentator, perhaps emphasize the fact that his commentaries are the ones that we all should be reading. So, St. Thomas died in 1274. He was canonized shortly after his death, as I said, by John the 22nd. He is an incredibly important figure in Western Christendom. If you're interested in knowing more about him, there is an excellent biography of him, simply called St. Thomas Aquinas, which was written by G.K. Chesterton. It is, like pretty much all of Chesterton's writings, well worth reading. As a first introduction to St. Thomas's philosophy, there is a book simply entitled Aquinas, written by Professor Edward Fesser. Pardon me. There's also, by the same Edward Fesser, a book called The Last Superstition, which particularly deals with the relevance of St. Thomas in responding to critics of religion like the New Atheists, like Dawkins and Sam Harris and Christopher Hitchens, etc. And aside from being, in my opinion, brilliantly written and very easy to read and very well argued, it's also, in my opinion, extremely funny, so I can't recommend that enough. As I said, my name is Jason Sabalo. I blog under the name The Masked Thomist. If you've enjoyed this video, please like it, please share it with your friends. Check out my blog and my Twitter feed, both of which I will link down below. I will also put a link down below to a shorter version of this video, so anyone who wants to learn more about St. Thomas but doesn't want to watch a full 20-minute video, they can watch the shorter version. Also, just so you know, my intention is to do 20-minute podcasts like this maybe once a fortnight, and then to occasionally, to do shorter videos, perhaps more frequently, just as when there's an issue that I think worth commenting on or someone asks me a question. If anyone's got an idea for what they'd like to see me talk about in my next podcast, please feel free to put that in the comments down below, or just if you've got a comment about what I've said here, please free to leave that in the comments down below. My name is Jason Sabalo. I blog under the name The Masked Thomist, and this has been episode 1 of the Masked Thomist podcast. Thank you very much for watching.